Thank you all for coming to this workshop today. We imagine this workshop to consist of a short dialogue between the two of us, and then a group discussion to discuss certain questions we prepared. Under the title Belonging Otherwise, Contemporary Feminist and Queer Perspectives on Literature and Politics, Slaven and I wanted to open certain questions on literature, relations of literature and politics, concept of politics of literature, and contemporary feminist and queer criticism. Our aim is also to encourage you to think of the potentials of feminist and queer critical perspectives in different genres, and we will devote our group discussion to that after our conversation. As we announced in our abstract, we wanted to open a discussion about a few very wide posed questions and give our perspectives on these questions, partly based on our research experience so far. So the first question we wished to open was how does literature shape and change the concepts of feminist and queer politics? And I will try to approach this question with a short comment on a certain genre in which I have a peculiar interest in recent months or maybe a year. And these are general accounts of feminist and queer criticism, kind of overviews or readers or certain editions which try to offer an insight into the whole field from the 1960s until today. So I will focus on some of those editions published in the last 2 decades. For me, most interesting approaches to the field of feminist and queer theory, and this is something which we already discussed in these 3 days, are those which offer an insight into complexity and heterogeneity of the field. And while working in the field of literary studies in general, I often came across many misunderstandings of the feminist and queer theory in general, and feminist and queer approaches to literature in particular. Therefore, an insight into feminist and queer literary studies as a complex field which consists of many theories, methodologies, and approaches seems to me as the best response against various misinterpretations we can come across. In the overviews of feminist literary theory and criticism published in the last decade, I even noticed a certain claim for feminist return to literature. And this return is sometimes understood as a crucial step in rethinking feminist politics. And we can also add to that in rethinking queer politics. While in 2003, Rita Felski published an influential book, Literature After Feminism, 2 decades later, maybe we can also reverse the question of how has literature changed the ways we think about feminism. This is something done by, for example, Robin Truth Goodman in the introduction to a collection titled Literature and the Development of Feminist Theory. It is published in 2015. The whole edition is based on the assumption that literature has a particular role to play in addressing current social, political, and cultural conditions. And the author of the mentioned introduction relies on some of the most influential 20th century theories of social and political dimensions of literature, such as Adorno, Hannah Arendt, Mikhail Bakhtin. And she raises the question of significance of literature for feminist politics. The author claims literature provides a space for thinking about how the world might have been different and might be different still. So some of the questions on the crucial relationship between literature and politics for contemporary feminist thought, which Goodman raises, are the following. Does the loss of a specifically literary concept correspond to social empowerment, conformism, and disidentification with politics? Is literature crucial to developing the ideas of social difference, consequential critique, dialogue, conflict, autonomy, social interaction, emancipation, and opposition that feminism requires. Thus, the persistence of a specifically feminist literary project allowed the imagination of a type of living together that jars, distorts, challenges, exceeds, and innovates current, unaccountable, disconnected, dystopic, even despotic social, political, and economic formations. So after this short introduction and raising these general questions about the relation of feminism and literature and the specificities of feminist literary studies, I would like to ask Slaven a question, which I'm sure he will thoroughly answer. What were the challenges in using queer theoretical approaches to canonical, we can consider canonical Yugoslav literature in your research so far?
Thank you. So my PhD dissertation, which was done at the European University in Vienna under Yasmina Lukic's supervision, unfortunately couldn't be with us, was a kind of exploration of the poetic structure in Ivo Andrić and Meša Selimović, two probably one of the most or two most canonical authors in Yugoslavia, and part of the point, so you can pose the general question, and I will try to be quite plastic with the kind of difficulties that I've encountered while working on the thesis. And the main problem was basically stemming from the fact that these were canonical, aka cis white normative men. So the kind of literature that I was analyzing has not been, of course, read from that perspective, but when you read these novels, you are encountered with a plethora, a multitude of different kinds of really heavily energized and forefronted relations between men. You have all kinds of relationships. Some of them are queer and homosexual, some of them are completely normative, some of them are hegemonic, some of them are oppositional. You have fraternity, you have kinship, you have elective kinship, you have adoptions between men, you have kind of bands of brothers and camaraderie, and all of them are kind of binding the structure of the novel, according to me. But in queer theory, you don't have an interpretative model or a theorization available to claim that. And so for me, part of the problem is to kind of re-theorize some of the, I mean, this sounds very bombastic and ambitious, but it was a kind of questioning of some of the presuppositions of queer theory, namely going back to, for instance, Eve Sedgwick and her work back in the 1990s, where she actually posited something that she called the unseparatist hypothesis. So if we go back to the 1990s and the time when queer theory kind of emerged, it was a methodological and theoretical effort to kind of overcome the sort of minoritarian or a kind of fragmentarian effort that was at that time being dominantly done in gay and lesbian studies. And this, of course, has something to do with the canon, because we can build, of course, minor canons, right? We can say gay and lesbian literature is a kind of canon in itself. Women literature is a canon in itself. But then again, that leaves us with the huge question of what about the canon, right? What about these guys? Well, this unseparatist hypothesis, according to Sedgwick, was a kind of call to use queer theory to read not only gay and lesbian authors, or queer authors in general, but also to read quote-unquote normative straight authors. And I don't think it happened. If you look at queer theory in general, the canonicity of some authors, the frequency with which they appear in scholarship, they are mostly queer authors, whether explicitly or implicitly. Virginia Woolf, Marcel Proust, Jean Genet, you name it. There is, of course, James Joyce is the kind of exception that kind of affirms the rule, but most of them are queer authors. So that got me thinking, if there's something in queer theory, and especially in queer literary scholarship, that implicitly binds the notion of queerness as a property of the text to a kind of unspoken authorial figure that is buttressing this property of the text that is always already queer in and of themselves. So for me, the problem was how to say that queerness is also a property of the text written by normative men, without resorting to a kind of quote unquote run-of-the-mill argument that I should perhaps subvert or kind of deconstruct their own figure. For me, that was the kind of project that I didn't want to deal with. These men were kind of, this is a very unclear argument, but bear with me, were very normative men, right? I mean, we could find in their biographies probably some sort of breakages in their subjectivity, but I mean, they were normative men. And also this normativity of theirs invites certain kinds of scholarship, but it invites feminist perspectives. We read Selimovic and Andrić, but also all other authors who were normative. We are interested in what they had to say about women, right? Because they were representative of this kind of normative patriarchy. So it tells us something about their text. These women in their text tell us something, not only about the text, but also about their perhaps personal or political or historical attitudes towards women. And for me, the question was, what does these relations between men tell us about the text itself? So for me, the main argument was these men write about other men, not in some sort of offhanded, disinterested way. These are not just male characters. They write about them because in a certain sense, they cannot write about it. So the whole structure of the literary text, or even the plot, if we look at it, the geopolitical conflicts, the criticism of state structures, the question of colonization of Bosnia. So all these kinds of geopolitical situations are also narrated through these relationships between men. And when we look at these relationships between men, sometimes we can actually access thematic strands in the novels that have perhaps previously been overlooked because the interest in these men has not been invited. So for me, the question was to kind of re-theorize the idea of the authorial figure as it emerges from queer theory, and to say that that we are always, when approaching the literary text, we always have in mind a kind of pre-coded authorial figure that has gendered and sexualized properties written in it that invites certain kinds of criticism, and it is good that it welcomes feminist interventions, right? This is a good thing, that when you open a book and you have like a bio at the end of the novel and it says Ivo Andrić, blah, 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 and then it says, I don't know, Ivo Andrić had a wife, and or in Mesha Selimovic, his great love for his wife, that you are interested, okay, let's see what these guys have to say about women. But this paratextual framework kind of preempts accessing these other kinds of sexualized and gender properties of the text, because in some sense, even queer theory and masculinity studies come short when it comes to the poetic dimensions of this text. They are interested in representational value of the text, right? Are there any gay characters? But they fall short of questioning the property of the text. Is this poetic? In a way in which, I don't know, their interest in geopolitics or history. So that was for me a kind of challenge and writing this thesis. And I want to ask Mirela, actually, because this is an ongoing discussion between us, is that when we look at queer theory and queer literature today, we kind of encounter, at least it seems to me, an opposite situation in which the authorial figure warrants interpretation, because it seems to me, again, we have a certain kind of privileging of the, and we can discuss this actually, what is the genre of autofiction that comes up so often these days, especially when it comes to queer authors. And I wondered what Mirela, you will think about these dynamics when it comes to the genre, and especially with feminist approaches to literature and autobiography in mind, because a lot of times this notion of autofiction guides interpretation into the direction of biographical context. So it kind of normativizes interpretation from the start, which is opposite for the problem that I've encountered, but it is what it is.
Thank you, Slaven. Well, exactly, as you said, this question, these problems or challenges you had in your research in relating the theoretical framework and analysis of the literary text really leads us to this question of genre and genre system in a wider sense, and to this question whether feminist and queer literature, how we define it, can be regarded as a certain genre, as a certain category, and to the question what is the criteria of categorization? Is it the author or the authorial function? Is it the dominance of a certain theme? Is it belonging to a certain literary movement? Or the understanding of feminist and queer dimension of literature lies somewhere else in the direction of what you did with reading the novels and the authors which you have chosen for your research. And we can indeed notice, especially in the critical production and the prevalence of this production in the digital space, circulation of this generic category of autofiction. And this is, at least in my view, accompanied with the relative oversight of, and this is, I don't use the word traditional in a pejorative sense, but the opposite of more traditional category of fiction, and the categorical apparatus of its analysis and interpretation, as we had for 100 years or more. And this term had its specific effects in the field of feminist and queer criticism. As Slaven notices, this term can turn us back to certain understandings of the literary text, which for us to also quote Derrida, he criticized as a sort of thematic criticism, while he emphasized the relevance of the concept of literarity. So I would like to begin from Derrida's claims in Positions, which is published in 1972, where he explains this notion of thematic criticism and the texts which inspired him to develop a certain view of literary text, which we still find very relevant and useful for our understanding of literature. So Derrida claims, it was, I believe, a decisive progress of this half-century, so he's referring to the half-century before the 1970s, to have explicitly formulated the question of literarity, notably starting with the Russian formalists, not only starting with them, by virtue of an ensemble of historical necessities, the most immediately determining one being a certain transformation of literary practice itself. So he refers also to the literary movements which were developed at the same time as the Russian formalism. So Derrida continues, the emergence of this question of literarity has permitted the avoidance of a certain number of reductions and misconstruings that always have a tendency to re-emerge. Thematism, sociologism, historicism, psychologism, in all their most disguised form. So he further explains, thus certain texts, and these are the texts of modernity and avant-garde in general, seem to me to mark and to organize the structure of resistance to the philosophical conceptuality that allegedly dominated or comprehended them, whether directly or whether through categories derived from this philosophical fund. The categories of aesthetics, rhetorics, or traditional criticism. For example, the values of meanings or content, of form or signifier, of metaphor, metonymy, of truth, of representation, and so on, at least in their classical form, can no longer account for certain very determined effects of these texts. And in relation to Derrida's arguments, I would like to turn to another author whose critique of the literary field was also founded on the formalist concept of literary text. And I read her very recently, I must admit this thanks to a suggestion by Professor Lada Čalet-Feldman to include it in the preparation of my book based on the doctoral dissertation. And that is Monique Wittig, whom I included in a certain analysis of the influence of historical avant-gardes on feminist conceptions of literature and literary revolutions. So why to include Monique Wittig in this discussion we are trying to develop? Because I think that although the essays I will refer to are written as early as the 1970s, so at the same time as the quoted Derrida's text, I find Wittig's perspective very relevant in approaching the question of generic categories such as autofiction, queer literature, even women's literature, and so on. Wittig could be interesting in this wider context of our discussions for many reasons, especially for her famous claim that a lesbian is not a woman, then of her criticism of certain misunderstandings of écriture féminine, then for the concept of subject, political engagement, engaged literature, and so on. But here I would just like to narrow it down to a certain arguments of her critique of the literary field. Wittig was interested in the entering of the so-called minority writers into the literary field. And although she was firstly interested for homosexuality in literature, both in homosexual authors and homosexuality as a theme, in my view, her insights are relevant for a broader understanding of the concept of literary engagement. So here I would refer to one of her essays titled The Point of View, Universal or Particular, which was published in the 1980s. And Wittig's arguments about minority writers were the following. So here is again a longer citation of Wittig from that essay. So writing by minority writers, she said, it is taking the risk that at every turn the formal element, which is the theme, will overdetermine the meaning, monopolize the whole meaning against the intention of the author who wants above all to create a literary work. Thus the text which adopts such a theme sees one of its parts taken for the whole, one of the constituent elements of the text taken for the whole text, and the book becomes symbol, a manifesto. When this happens, the text ceases to operate at the literary level. It is subjected to disregard in the sense of ceasing to be regarded in relation to equivalent texts. It becomes a committed text with a social theme and it attracts attention to a social problem. When this happens to a text, it is diverted from its primary aim, which is to change the textual reality within which it is inscribed. In fact, by reason of its theme, it is dismissed from that textual reality. It no longer has access to it, it is banned, often simply by the silent treatment or by failure to reprint. It can no longer operate as a text in relationship to other texts or contemporary texts. It is interesting only to homosexuals. Taken as a symbol or adopted by a political group, the text loses its polysemy. It becomes univocal. This loss of meaning and lack of grip on the textual reality prevents the text from carrying out the only political action that it could. And this political action, in her sense, is introducing into the textual tissue of the times, by way of literature, that which it embodies. So this by way of literature is crucial part of her argument and actually pretty much analogous to the current debates on politics of literature as being political as literature with the by way of literature. And regarding this question, this long decades question of the relation between universal and particular, her conclusion is that one must work to reach the general, even while starting from an individual or specific point of view. This is true for straight writers, but it is true as well for minority writers. And furthermore, she concludes a text by a minority writer is effective only if it succeeds in making the minority point of view universal, only if it is an important literary text. So her general conclusions about what is the work or the purpose or the aim of the writer, she claims is to concern themselves with the letter, the concrete, the visibility of language, that is its material form. Since the time that language has been perceived as material, and I think that this time is the time of emergence of modernity and historical avant-garde, it has been worked word by writers. It is maybe since the 1970s. It is a long time since that text and that view of literature has been published. But I think that in the context of these current discussions, and especially the discussions about the generic system of contemporary literature, this concept of materiality of language, of literary form, of literature being political as literature, are really necessary to be included again in approaching the question what is the politics of literature and what would be a feminist and queer critical dimension of literature. And what maybe distinguishes this thematic narrowing of autofiction towards queer literature is also an oversight of other elements of text, of literary text, and we can see these dynamics both in the field of post-Yugoslav literature, but also in other contexts we already reached during this day, and some of these contexts are translation context. So Slaven will comment more on that perspective in relation to what we already touched on.
Yes, I mean, thank you for it, because Monique, we take this question of like, what does quote unquote minority literature offer us in terms of its universality? And I think this is especially true in the context of post-Yugoslav queer literature, where it is often read as thematic, right? So it is often read as, in the language of dominant queer theory, as subverting in terms of desire, in terms of being emancipatory, etc., which is all, of course, true, and should read these novels and short stories and poetry and all kinds of literary works for these purposes. But there is, I think, something that these texts are telling us, and this is just a kind of suggestion, which occurred to me actually when I was reading a recent interview with a left-wing Ukrainian media commons by our very own Mirela Dakić, who had this to say. The increase, and this is when we were asked about the context of the 1990s war and domestic dynamics. And Mirela said, the increase in domestic violence in the post-war time actually happened because of a lot of frustration, unsolved problems, and shared anxiety linked to male PTSD syndrome. Namely, violence from the battlefield was partially transferred into the domestic sphere, and women became its first victims. Women were not prepared for this new situation, since as a society, we were not ready to deal with the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and its implications. There was not any psychological support for either war defenders or women as their victims. Also, women didn't report what happened to them for so many reasons, including the one justifying behavior of war veterans. However, domestic violence always increases after any war, no matter how we perceive or define it. So this actually got me thinking, because post-Yugoslav queer literature is, of course, for the most part, subsumed under these categories of autofiction and coming-of-age stories. When we look at the generation of these writers, they were the writers who grew up during the 1990s and came out of age in, for instance, say, early 2000s. And even in authors like Pešutor, Bojan Krivokapić, or Leila Kalamov, so these notable queer figures, this got me thinking that these queer children were also victims of PTSD fathers. And when you look at these novels, you can see that they are over and over again describing how homophobic, transphobic, misogynistic the men that they grew up with were. So I think when we think about Monique Wittig basically inviting us to use minority literature as a window into some of the not only minority issues, which we can discuss what is a minority issue, but like into something more universal, is I think also the question of what these queer perspectives are telling us in terms of how a domestic situation becomes a necropolitical theater in a post-war situation, right? Because they have very complicated relationships with their fathers. And I think this is a kind of window that we can open up and use queer literature to tell us something more than just queerness and design, which are all good themes, and we should explore them, but not perhaps stay only with these questions. And I want to end, and I will read this because I wrote it, but it's a kind of now this is the definition of the circular argument. So on the first day, I basically said that I don't know what radicality is, and later on this got me thinking that it was not a fair answer. So bear with me with a longer answer of what I think radicality could be, and with regards to everything that we were talking about. I propose to entertain the idea of translating our question, what is radicality, into another question that actually Silvana mentioned during her opening remarks: what would happen if? Now, what would happen, indeed, is an almost inverted question of the Leninist maxim, what is to be done, at least in my view. What is to be done echoes, of course, the intention and the mission of Enlightenment-centered political project of harnessing the supposed powers of human action and will to overcome, let's say, nature and time themselves. Our name for the general operational modality of this willingness is modernity, and has many guises. The first modernity and the second modernity, the solid modernity, the liquid modernity, the punitive and disciplinary modernity, the fascist and socialist modernity, the never achieved modernity, and so on. On the other hand, our question, or at least my and Silvana's question, what would happen if, substitutes the programmatic faith into the capacities of the human, whatever that anthropocentric figure means, with the deep unfamiliarity, indeed the incalculability of the future to come, the past future, or in the language of the construction, future anteriority. What would happen sets the stage for what will have been. Now, of course, the one does not preclude the other, and two things may be true. The call for emancipation is, of course, not cancelled by the prospect of its presupposed or speculated futility. In short, we must fight even if we tentatively welcome our defeat, which is very bleak and sad, but perhaps sometimes true. The two questions appear in our times in parallel, marked as our times are by a general miasma of uncertainty amidst the pending ecological doom of the planet, the unpredictability and somewhat ridiculous panic surrounding artificial intelligence, an escalating global conflict, and a way of life that is perhaps to be no more. Now, in literary studies, the question of modernity and modernism translates into the question of genre. What would happen is a question that ossifies not only into speculative fiction and science fiction, but also haunts the promise of high modernist literature to undo the predictability of the very structure of the novel, and indeed the meaning-making machine of the plot, and usher in the horror and promise of a break with the confines of traditional writing. What would happen if nothing actually happened? What would happen if the door opens and the tiger leaves, as Rhoda and Virginia Woolf's The Waves muses? Quite radical, we could say. So what would be our tiger behind the door? Okay, so what I want to end this coda with is a kind of speculative commentary about radicality as future anterior. Just the other day, Lada defined translation, which I really like, defined translation as non-performative work for the other. One can think of culture as always already a specific form of translation. Post-colonial and post-structuralist theories of culture certainly would agree to this. And philological studies would undoubtedly point out that what is often perceived as the very pinnacle of culture, namely European philosophy in antiquity, has been mostly preserved by its Arabic translators. Interestingly, Silvana questioned the phallocentrism of textuality precisely by posing the question of what would happen to a certain male-authored text once it went through the hands of a woman translator. A woman translator, in this case, if I understood you correctly, would function as a disruption between the homosocial bond of implicit friendship between the male author and his male translator or translators. The friend is always male, Derrida taught us, a homosocial linkage. The friendship or fraternity across time and space, but not interestingly, across cultural context. Indeed, so much so indebted to a particular cultural context that a homosocial linkage, the fraternity established in absence of blood ties, provides the building blocks of this particular cultural context, indeed, of culture as such, as far as we can define it. It was certainly true of Derrida's of grammatology. Beatrice Spivak translated Derrida into English and was a woman translator, but interestingly, of grammatology was translated in Yugoslavia also by a woman translator, Jerka Šifrer-Crnić. Now, what is radicality? Echoes the etymological root of radix, meaning root. So what do? We root. Some of the definitions of radicality we here propose were almost botanical in image, and all invoke the notion of hands, of dexterity, taking or giving care, fighting, nurturing, loving, rooting out, and for the most part, evoked an image of this hand, stimulation, including sexual, manipulation, including economic, machination, including political, aggression, including misogynistic, including homophobic, transphobic, including hitting, pushing and shoving, including torture, including murder, but also including helping out, giving each other a hand. What happens to roots and what happens to hands and what happens to radicality, male homosociality, gender and literature once a woman translator finally intervenes? Emily Wilson, the first woman translator of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, intervened into these texts both formally and philologically in 2017 and 2018 when these translations were published. She translated not only verse into prose, which was in itself a hugely controversial issue, as you can imagine, but also undid the sedimented mistranslations that subsequently formed the readerly reception. For instance, she substituted all domestic servants' specific titles, for instance, chambermaid and cook, into a simple slave. The argument was these were all slaves, and if you read it in English, this kind of gets lost because they're all, just servants. She also translated the many names for women into morally neutral terms of antiquity, such as companion or hetera or courtesan. The male translators over the centuries translated these terms as tramps and common horse. And one example that stuck with me ever since is that of Penelope's hands. As she opens a cabinet with weapons, the text, Emily Wilson notes, describes her hand as thick, something that obviously shocked male translators as it did not fit in within their notions of what a properly feminine hand should look like. So they translated it as either gentle or steady. Wilson calls her hand muscular to emphasize her agency, but also to point out the very logical, the logical cause of her hand being muscular. She does embroidery. And of course, her forearms are thick, right? Muscular. So what does this tell us? Wilson teaches us that it sometimes takes thousands of years for us to see that indeed we can handle things in a radically different manner. Perhaps the fraternity of Homer's male translators would be shocked by the way in which gender, out of all things, reveals the general structure of their cultural translation. They would most certainly be shocked that their own subjectivities, hidden under the supposed neutrality of just translation, got rooted out by a woman translator who was an unannounced, completely radical figure from their distant future, their future interiority.